significa acabar. No, tampoco.
Crec que és per molt que és una IP fora de l'autònom.
Ha dit el cos
and so everything is on
la gent del Zoom.
I ara ella... A veure, ja pots començar. Ah, ja està. Ens estan sentint.
Gràcies, Isa.
Ara que està.
Enviats que... Ayuda, you see the max did not get infected.
You would have been more parking.
Well, either somewhere drinking or somewhere working.
Can you invite me to go out drinking? You invite me to go out for drinking. If you go out for drinking, just let me know.
Okay.
Good reason.
I think we should start. We will start. Jordi just texted me that he's stuck on the train. Should I leave the door open? Aquí
está.
Ah, perfect. Just on time. You were time. Jason, Jordi, Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this event. It means a lot to us, to the management team of ICTA and to the rest of colleagues. I think that I speak on behalf of everyone in this building and beyond when I say that the colleagues that will be presenting today are people we always wanted to come to ICTA to work with us. So it will be a privilege to hear more about them. I won't say much. I will just briefly say that Jason Hickl is an anthropologist by training, that he left the London School of Economics to come here, that he's a Beatriz de Galindo senior professor here at the university, and he's affiliated to both ICTA and the Department of Anthropology. His work, as you know, is basically focused on the study of global inequalities. And what we hope is that together with Yorgos and all other colleagues here at ICTA who work on issues of global justice, global inequalities, and growth, he contributes to make this team, these ongoing efforts even stronger and situate us even more in the global map of research on these issues. With some that they actually should I just get closer? Yeah. Yes, Good. And then the second person who will be talking today is Jordi Honey-Rosés. He's a urban planner by training. We met a long time ago when he was doing his PhD research on ecosystem services here in Catalonia, and I said, well, we need to bring him to ICTA at some point. And he's been an associate professor at the University of British Columbia for 7 years. And he will be joining our colleagues working on sustainable, healthy, and just cities, and also helping us to make that research even more important than it already is at ICTA. So without further ado, just let me say that the arrival of both Jason and Jordi is part of a super ambitious plan that ICTA has to renew the seniors group. And I'm also really happy to announce that we recently convinced Armin Shadel here in the audience, Uriol Marquet also here in the audience, and Elia Apostolopoulou, who is not with us here, but will join us in 2022. The three of them, as Ramon y Cajal, senior fellows, also here at ICTA. Together with Sergio Villamayor, we really hope that they will become the seniors of reference in a few years to come. So thank you, Jordi. Thank you, Jason. And Jason was asking me, and maybe Jordi too, if there's a problem if they remove the mask while talking. Is that okay for everyone? Yeah. So, Jason, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks very much, and it's wonderful to be with you all. I haven't done many sort of in-person presentations over the past couple of years, so it's a new and exciting experience. But thank you so much for the warm welcome to those of you who had a chance to engage with me so far. I'm excited for the years ahead. Okay, so I only have 15 minutes, and it's difficult to explain my research trajectory in a short period of time like that, so I'm not going to cover everything, just maybe a few points that might be of interest to you all, and ideas for possible collaborations in the future. So let's see. I want to focus just briefly on my background studying global inequality. Mainly my research questions the sort of dominance narrative that's out there about convergence or catch-up developments between the global south and the global north. In fact, in reality, there's no real convergence in absolute terms in the world economy. Here I have the global north plotted against the global south. The north here is effectively USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Japan, Korea, and the global south is the rest of the world. So the per capita income gap between the global north and global south has quadrupled since the end of colonialism. And so this is sort of the question that I begin with. What's going on in the global economy that enables this pattern of extraordinary divergence and prevents the possibility of catch-up developments? which is kind of a challenge to existing discourses on international development. So I critique the assumptions of methodological nationalism, the idea that the success of the global north is due purely to internal conditions and policies, whereas the apparent failure of the global south is due to some kind of structural inadequacy on their part. Okay. So I seek to situate this trajectory of divergence within the broader history of capitalism and colonialism since the 16th century. So this is mostly captured in my work in The Divide. I'll just briefly run through some of my core arguments. The first is that capitalism and colonialism must be understood as having arisen together from the 15th century onward. They can't really be separated conceptually and historically, right? The rise of capitalism depended on the colonial projects, utterly. So capitalist growth in the core of the world system is dependent on extraction from and control over the economies of the periphery. And we see that apparently in terms of resources, of course, this is evidence in the colonial projects. The appropriation of silver, cotton, sugar, grain, etc., was essential to industrialization in the global north, but also in terms of labor, both enslaved labor as well as indentured, and also labor that was sort of coerced through colonial taxation regimes. But also it depends on captive markets in the global south in order to sort of absorb the excess overproduction of northern capital, without which capitalism begins to sort of fall apart. Okay, so my argument is that capitalism actually requires this kind of colonial arrangement to maintain a low supply price to stabilize hard currency. What I mean by that is without this kind of external frontier, then capitalism in the global north faces a constant crisis, which is that the price of labor and resources has a tendency to increase, especially given aggressive labor demands from organized unions and so on, and a reduction in the availability of easily accessible resources. This generates inflation and threatens the possibility of capital accumulation. And so to stabilize currencies and maintain capital accumulation, you have to have some kind of third party or frontier where you can depress the supply price, right? So capitalism actually sort of requires this arrangement, is my argument. During the period of decolonization, we see this arrangement comes under threat. Progressive and radical anti-colonial movements in the global south succeeded in sort of overthrowing imperial power during this period and pursued a project of economic sovereignty. This is evident in the Bandung movement, the movement that emerged after the Bandung Conference in 1955, with sort of radical global south leaders uniting in this project for economic sovereignty, using tariffs and subsidies and import and substitution industrialization, capital controls and so on, which really transformed the world economy actually substantially. It led to a kind of crisis for capitalism. It effectively dismantled the colonial arrangements, right? So it reduced northern access to the cheap labor, resources, and raw material and markets that they had enjoyed under the colonial arrangements. Okay, this had the effect of increasing the supply price, and so we see a process of inflation in the core economies in the 1970s in particular, which threatens the possibility of northern growth and profits rates and ultimately capital accumulation itself. Triggered a crisis of capitalism in the core economies. Northern states had to respond to this somehow to restore the conditions for growth and profit accumulation. And they did so by, initially through military interventions to topple progressive leaders in the global south, replacing them with regimes that were more amenable to northern economic interests, but also most importantly, and this is the crux of my argument, through the process of imposing structural adjustment programs across the global south. And you're all familiar with what these basically are. They privatized state-held assets and services. They cut social spending on healthcare and education. They liberalized trade regimes, so basically cut the tariffs and subsidies and capital controls that progressive governments had been using so effectively to achieve economic sovereignty. They cut protections on labor and the environment, thereby driving prices down for labor and resources, right? So this, the imposition of structural adjustment during the 80s and 90s effectively restored the colonial arrangements, right? It depressed Southern prices. and therefore temporarily rescued northern growth, right? So this was sort of the solution that northern capital came to in response to the anti-colonial struggle. And this is effectively the world economy that we live in today, right? Now, okay, so that's just kind of background. Now the effect of this depression, or this constraint of southern prices, is manifest in what we call unequal exchange. And I've published a couple of articles on this recently, in New Political Economy, and one coming out soon, inshallah, in Global Environmental Change. Effectively, for every, when you have significant price inequalities in the world economy between North and South, because for every unit of import of labor and resources the South imports from the North, they then therefore have to export many more times to pay for it because of price inequalities in international trade and global commodity chains. So this leads to a net outflow from South to North of resources and embodied labor. And we've been able to document this empirically through input-output databases involving colleagues, including Christian Dorninger, who I've been working with recently. So we can see this net flow: 12 billion tons of embodied raw materials, 21 exajoules of embodied energy, 821 million hectares of embodied lands, and 188 million person years of embodied labor flowing from South to North each year. This data is from 2015. So just to give you a perspective on this, 821 million hectares of embodied land, that's twice the size of India, right? So that's lands twice the size of India. It is devoted entirely to production for global North consumption, right? Without any equivalence exchange. 188 million person years of embodied labor is the entire workforce of Latin America, effectively working all year long, producing goods for Northern consumption without any equivalent exchange. 21 exajoules of embodied energy is enough to completely meet to completely cover the energy gap for decent living around the world, bringing everyone up to a high standard of living as described by my colleague Julia Steinberger and her team. So this net appropriation accounts for about 25% of total Northern consumption. So you get a sense for how, for the extreme dependence of Northern economies on appropriation from the global South, it's huge. That's on average. When we compare that quantity of resources to Northern prices, we can basically give it a price, and it comes to about 10.8 trillion US dollars per year, or over the period 1990 to 2015, 242 trillion dollars over that period. So, I mean, a significant sort of boon or windfall for the global North, achieved effectively for free. So the implications of this are interesting to me. First of all, it becomes evident, and this is an argument that's been developed in the literature on ecologically unequal exchange, that the impacts of Northern resource use are externalized to the global South, right? So the benefits are accrued in the North, and the ecological impacts are externalized to the South. Furthermore, Southern resources are effectively mobilized around servicing Northern growth, and are therefore not available to meet local human needs. Okay, so labor and resources through appropriation is no longer available for use values in human development. The implication also further is that catch-up development is basically impossible within an economy that's organized around imperialist appropriation. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that we see patterns of divergence in the world economy given patterns of imperial appropriation. This also helps us understand persistent poverty in the global South, which we can see as an effect of price compression in the global South, right? The more prices are compressed in the global South, the less income obviously they have. And furthermore, we can understand poverty as an absence of access to the labor and resources necessary to meet human needs. So again, this should not be surprising. It should not be surprising that 3.5 to 4 billion people don't have access to the resources necessary to live good lives, given this the structure of the global economy. There's also here, I think, a case for reparations to be made. And with colleagues in the Harvard Lancet Commission, we've been developing this case specifically also for the impacts of structural adjustment. I think this has interesting implications for climate economy models, and I'd love to discuss this with those of you who work on this issue, actually. One being that existing damage functions in climate economy models don't sufficiently account for core periphery dependencies. What I mean by that is, in existing models, when there's economic damage in the global south, then this is considered to be basically isolated, right? It doesn't necessarily affect global north economies at all. Once we understand the utter dependence of global north accumulation and growth on production in the global south, that changes the calculus, I think. And we have to understand that a disruption in supply price in the south, or a disruption of productive capacity in the south, due to drought or human displacement or whatever it might be, would have significant knock-on effects in the global north, posing, I think, a significant threat to capital accumulation. And so damages to northern GDP are likely to be much greater, I think, than existing models predict. And that's something I think that would warrant further research. I've also done some work on this, on the Sustainable Development Index, which I developed a year or two ago. I published this in Academic Economics. It effectively corrects the Human Development Index for ecological impacts. It's an efficiency indicator that gives us a sense for which countries in the world are most efficient in terms of delivering human developments with minimal ecological overshoot of planetary boundaries. The results are available online at that address. The unsurprising winner of this competition is Costa Rica. A couple of other Latin American, North African, and Eastern European states. We've also recently done some research on responsibility for climate breakdown. This I published in the Lancet Planetary Health. My argument here is that we should think about responsibility for climate breakdown in terms of national emissions in excess of fair shares of the safe planetary boundary of 350 parts per million. So when we think about it that way, then what we see is that the global north is responsible for the vast majority of excess emissions, namely about 92% of them. And the global south, despite having the vast majority of the world's population, is responsible for a very small proportion of excess emissions. So I think this is a fair, more just way to think about climate responsibility, and also liability for climate damages, and potentially grounds for reparations claims as well. Drawing from insights from my colleagues in the global south, I like to think of this as a process of atmospheric colonization. Northern economies having claimed much more of the atmospheric commons than is their fair share. With some other colleagues, I've recently extended this analysis to resource use to think about responsibility for ecological breakdown on the grounds that we can think of resource footprints as good proxies for environmental pressure. So we know the resource use has been rising dramatically over the past several decades. There's some research that suggests a sustainable corridor for material use is between 25 and 50 gigatons per year. Here I have the 50 gigaton line. So the question then becomes, who's responsible basically for excess resource use in excess of these sustainable boundaries? So we apply a similar kind of method, and the results allow us to sort of figure out national overshoot of fair shares of that sustainable corridor between the years 1970 and 2017. The global north here is responsible again for the vast majority, China for 15%, and the global south for another 8%, the rest of the global south. So here too becomes clear that northern economies are the main drivers of ecological breakdown. Interestingly, China's contribution to ecological breakdown only begins happening in the 2000s. Prior to that, China is actually well under their fair share of material sort of resource allotments, if you will. So that's an interesting development. I've started to think about this as sort of grounds for calling for a kind of anti-colonial politics of degrowth. So on the grounds that we understand northern growth appropriates southern ecosystems and atmospheric commons, we should think about demands for degrowth being situated within a broader history of anti-colonial struggle. And in fact, I think that these demands have basically been around in this form, kind of avant la lettre of degrowth for at least the past 70 years. It's evident in Gandhi's work, in Fanon's work, in Thomas Sankara's work, in Julius Nyerere work. Their claim is that growth in the global north is a process of appropriation and colonization, and needs to be resisted on those grounds. This is evident also in the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, which I think is one of the most important documents on ecological breakdown that we have. So I think making these connections is really quite important for the degrowth scholarship and social movements. With Yorgos here, we did a paper recently in New Political Economy on the question, is green growth possible? Very briefly, our findings are basically, there's no evidence that GDP can be absolutely decoupled from material footprints in historical data as well as in future model projections, even under high efficiency conditions. And further, it's unlikely that high income countries can achieve decarbonization fast enough to stay within fair shares of 1.5 and 2 degree carbon budgets while pursuing growth at the same time because of the relationship between GDP and energy use. More energy use makes it more difficult to decarbonize fast enough for Paris targets. On the back of that, my colleagues and I have called for post-growth climate mitigation models, including some colleagues here. Our argument is that existing scenarios start from the assumption that growth should continue in all countries, regardless of how rich they've already become. And as a result, they're forced to rely heavily on negative emissions technologies and unprecedented and untested, unproven rates of decoupling of GDP from energy use, which we don't think are justified in the scientific literature. So we argue that post-growth pathways may make it easier to achieve rapid decarbonization without relying on speculative technological change. So let me just wrap up by mentioning a couple of near-term projects that I'm interested in pursuing. One would be to develop a post-growth SSP, or shared socioeconomic pathway, that would allow us to do climate mitigation scenario modeling without the assumption of continued growth in rich countries. Drawing on literature from industrial ecology and degrowth and ecological economics. I'd also like to explore the possibility of north-south convergence in terms of resource and energy use in these scenarios. As Aliosa and I have been working on recently, we find that there's large disparities between the north and the south in existing climate mitigation scenarios that are maintained through the rest of the century. And we think this is unjust and politically untenable. So we should be exploring convergence scenarios where we have a decline in energy and resource use in the north to a level that's consistent with universal human well-being and ecological stability and rapid decarbonization. I'm also interested in exploring what would be the material requirements of decent living, sort of extending Julia Steinberger's team's ideas about what are the energy requirements for decent living. What about if we think about that in terms of material requirements? What resource base and infrastructure build out is necessary for decent living? For those of you who are involved in material flows research, obviously this is more than any single person can do alone, so it will take a team of people, but it's something that I'm interested in pursuing if you'd like to collaborate. I'm also interested in thinking more about what are the drivers of social progress beyond GDP, like what are the key provisioning factors and policies that are historically associated with improvements in human well-being indicators like life expectancy and education, access to electricity and decent housing, et cetera, et cetera. My feeling reading this literature is this has not actually been spelled out with the empirical rigor that it could be. And so I think there's room for us to do a bit more to open up questions about the existing dominant assumption that GDP is the major driver of improvements in well-being. And finally, I'm working a little bit more these days on what policies would be necessary in the global south to achieve a kind of unilateral decolonization. What would it look like to, instead of waiting for some kind of justice to be bequeathed by international institutions in terms of improved or fairer trade rules and finance rules, et cetera, what would it look like if global south countries were able to act themselves to limit the extent to which they're exploited by northern capital. So this is a difficult question actually to work with, but I'm drawing on ideas from Samir Amin and other people from the 1960s and 70s and 80s and coupling that with research being done now by MMT economists from the Global South, who I think have really promising things to offer us. So that's another kind of direction of my research now. So that's it for now. And yeah, I look forward to having conversations with you all about any of these topics that interest you. Feel free to reach out, and I mean, I'm here to collaborate and share ideas. So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks very much.
I would invite a couple of short, brief questions to the point for Jason, questions or comments while Jordi prepares his presentation. Anyone, any quick reaction? Graham, thank you both. Ladies first.
So I have a comment. First, I think it's extremely impressive, and it's wonderful to have another colleague who works on inequality and justice. I'm wondering, your training was in anthropology, and you've moved into very global analysis like big data sets, very macro level, basically empirical research. How do you still bring anthropology in, or did you fully renegade your anthropology path? I love anthropology.
Yeah, no, I think that it's because of anthropology that I began thinking about the world system in the way that I do. But I realized there's limits to describing it without the necessary empirical data to sort of convince your readers that that's how things are actually working. So actually, when I read some of your work and work on material flows and so on, I mean, to me, this was very, very inspiring to see that we can document this empirically. So that's kind of, I guess that's the way that I think about it. Anthropology is profoundly insightful on a kind of theoretical level and ethnographic level, but doesn't really normally have access to the data necessary to convince a broader audience beyond social science. And so that's clearly what's necessary when it comes to policy. And so that's kind of where I'm at.
Do you think it's perhaps too early to tell, but is the current pandemic a potential force of equalization or exacerbation of the North-South divide? It's probably too early to tell. But
well, there's some early data on that, and it looks like exacerbation. It's significantly worsens poverty rates in the Global South, and sort of depressed incomes further for the poorest half of the world's population. And the effect obviously in the North has been much more muted, actually. But there are some interesting possibilities that Aliosa is actually working on regarding whether we can sort of recover from the pandemic in a way that doesn't pursue a rebound in emissions. So I think in terms of post-growth pathways, there's interesting things to think about there. But in terms of inequality so far, things don't look great.
Thank you, Jason. Jason's office is in the southern wing of the building, first floor. So go look for him and ask him difficult questions. Jordi, all yours.
All right. Thank you, Jason, for a very inspiring presentation.
So, sorry, this is from the audience.
Jump into it because I have a lot of ground that I want to cover today. So thanks for the opportunity. I hope to cover sort of who I am as an individual, what my values are, what my research agenda is, and how I can contribute to the community. It's going to be a very forward-looking presentation, so I'm not going to talk about a lot of my past work. So apologies to Steven and some of those that I've worked with in the past. It's really going to be much a forward-looking presentation. Okay, so first, who am I? So in 2 words, I say that I'm an environmental planner, and planning as a discipline in North America has sort of its own space that's between architecture, geography, and civil engineering. And I've worked largely on questions of impact evaluation. So how do we know that certain policies or programs have a result or have an impact that we would like it to see? I've looked at those questions in forest sort of land use change context, but I've increasingly been looking at those questions in a more urban context on questions of public space. And I'm particularly interested in urban experiments, which I'd like to talk to you a little bit about in just a minute. So, so this is my life in a bar chart, and the colors don't come up too well, but I did grow up in Silicon Valley. I did grow up in Silicon Valley, California, and with a mother from Catalonia, from the Penedès region. So I was very fortunate to speak Catalan and to visit Catalonia in the summers. And along my journey, I've had many, many inspiring mentors that I want to sort of recognize through my path. It's funny that Jason talks a lot about the sort of these classical ideas of political economy, because one of my greatest mentors at UC Berkeley was a Caribbean historian, but he taught the intro to political economy course, and that, of course, reading the classics was very inspiring to me. After Berkeley, I went to Mexico and I worked with forest communities, and there, of course, the communities themselves and colleagues who worked with forest communities were my inspiration there. Then I went to the Kennedy School at Harvard, and there I had the opportunity to work with Richard Foreman, who's a landscape ecologist, and also Jose Gomez-Ibanez, who studied issues of infrastructure. So two very different perspectives, from the ecological perspective and the sort of essentially neoliberal economist. And then I pursued my doctorate at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign with a stream ecologist and an environmental economist. So the stream ecologist also did a lot of work on environmental history, encouraged me to explore those pursuits. I was able to spend a brief time in Girona at the Water Institute up there, where I was completing my research on Barcelona's drinking water supply. And then I also spent another brief time at the SIGA, at the Geography Institute in Mexico. I know there's a lot of ICTA-SIGA connections here. Met Jaime Panequio, I think many of you know as well. And then the last 8 years, I've been at the University of British Columbia in the planning school, and of course, having a PhD in regional planning, working more in the watershed scale. I've been increasingly been pushed into a more sort of city urban scale. Okay, so what are my values? I think this is important. Planners, when we talk about developing plans, it's often important to begin with what our values are, because that really dictates the orientation of what any actions you might want to take. So just a few bullet points on sort of my values in terms of research. First, I would put curiosity. The reason why we engage in research is because there's this puzzle to the world that we don't quite understand how it quite works. And I encourage my students always to pursue their own sort of genuine curiosity. I think that's the best recipe for quality research. Collaboration, I'm sure this is very common. Many of you are in the same boat, would probably put this as well. Working with partners and individuals who are on the ground and living and experiencing the real issues day to day, of course, is critical. Quality over volume. So, I've gone through the tenure process at UBC and pushed out a lot of papers, and I'm ready to really focus on what sort of quality research can we do that can truly change how discussions are made or how communities see themselves in actions that can be taken. So I'd really like the rest of my career to really focus on quality. Community building, of course, within our own community as the researchers and students, but also with others. And then lastly, diverse ways of knowing. I think what I'm going to present to you today is going to be quite positivistic in some regards, and I hope you'll excuse me and forgive me for that, but I want to let you know that I believe that we should be respectful to all sorts of types of knowledges and knowing, and in the university units that have succeeded in creating that mutual respect across different ways of knowing have thrived and have done really well from my experience. And then there's also this great quote from Thoreau, I think encapsulates some of the ideas of my values. He said, what you get by achieving your goals is not as important as what you become by achieving your goals, right? So it's really about the process and who we are and who we become, rather than merely being goal driven. Okay, so what is my research agenda? Again, this is sort of the forward thinking part of my work, sort of looking ahead. I'd like to create a small research group called City Lab Barcelona, and then the terms are intentional. So city because I'm increasingly more focused on urban questions. Lab because I'm interested in urban experiments. I'm going to develop that in just a minute. And also Barcelona is intentional. I I've done a lot of work in Latin America, I've had collaborations in Mexico and in Panama and in Central America. And I've in the past few months, I've been saying goodbye to those collaborations. And in many regards, it hurts me a little bit, but I'm ready to really, if I'm coming here, I'm really going to roll up my sleeves and dig into this ecosystem. So this is going to be, Barcelona will be my research lab, or the city will be at my playground for research work. And the City Lab Barcelona aims to study the impacts of urban interventions using formal experiments or direct observation. So again, coming back to this theme of impact evaluation, understanding what works, what doesn't work, why not, under which conditions do certain policies make a difference or not, what's the heterogeneity, what might work with some populations and not with others. So understanding sort of these causal relations to improve policy, and hopefully using experiments if possible. I mean, it's very difficult to experiment. Urban planners aren't trained to think experimentally. So I'd like to push that boundary of knowledge. And if not experience, at least with direct observation. Sort of observation being sort of the origins of the scientific process. And of course, in the lab we observe. And I think there's a lot of room for quality observational work, not only for research purposes, but also for training purposes. And that's part of the reasons that led me into this work. And I'll give an example of what I mean by observation with training with students in just a minute. So research questions, wow, that comes up really small, so my apologies. But just to give you a broad sense of sort of some of the questions that I'm interested in looking at, sort of what can formal urban experiments tell us about behavior, travel choice, and use of public space? In a similar vein, how can we integrate formal experiments into day-to-day practice and management? And again, I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by this. If the word experiments, it seems a little abstract. How I may use tactical urban interventions to study the city. I see room for opportunities there. And then the last two are a little bit more specific questions. What is the impact of street calming and pedestrianization on the quality of public space? What is the impact of bicycle training programs or experience for school-aged children? So again, see that these are sort of impact evaluation questions of very specific policies that are being rolled out in the city and elsewhere. So if I had a criteria of sort of what future projects to say yes to and which to say no to, this is sort of what I'm thinking of and right now is sort of what the criteria would be. I would like a project to be part of our group if it's an impact evaluation question, if it studies a real action or a real implementation, either by ourselves or by a city partner, like the Protegiendo las Escolas program that I'll discuss in just a minute. If it's an experiment, either formal or maybe informal experiment, or if there's direct observation. So those are, this actually excludes a lot of things, right? And it's a lot of things that I've done in the past. So downloading survey data and running few regressions through it, that's not included in this because that doesn't include any of those criteria, right? So I'd really like to focus on this sort of type of research project to, again, be true to this idea of the city lab. So I've been throwing out the word experiment a lot, and I want to give an example of past work. This is my only example of past work that gives you a sense of what I mean by experiment. And it's one experiment, a couple of papers came out of it, but it's the Vancouver public life experiment. And it begins with as research should theory, right? This idea that came from an observer of public life. This fellow named William White, relatively well known in the urban planning community. He's this guy who lived on the tops of buildings in New York City, and he photographed and he filmed how people moved in city plazas and the street. And he spent hours and hours just watching how people moved on sidewalks and where they went to plazas and when they had lunch. And from that observation, he developed theory about how people behaved in public space. And one of his ideas that emerged from that's later been developed by Jan Gell and others, Brent Toderen, was this idea that if there are people in a public space, if it's a lively public space, the more people will be attracted to it, right? So summarized here in this quote, what attract people most, it would appear, is other people, right? So this idea has been developed by sort of these consultant city planners who go around the world selling their consultancy services, like Brent Toderen, who's come up with this idea of sticky streets, right? So how do we create sticky streets where people hang around and it's lively? Actually, Brent Toderen was just invited to Barcelona at the Superia conference not too long ago. So again, these ideas are real and really being sold around in the international sort of urban city building sphere. But this idea hasn't really been, until this experiment, hadn't been tested. And so I said, well, can we test this idea through an experiment. And so it leaves us to the question, how do behaviors and perceptions change when there are more people in public space? Right? Simple question. More people, what happens to behavior and what happens to perceptions? So I took a street that's actually there's urban development going up around it. There are neighbors who don't want more people going there because there's sort of this anti-densification rhetoric. So it's the perfect condition to sort of study what might happen if this street has more people. So since the urban development going in is going to be of UBC students, I recruited students who were Confederates, or essentially actors, who would go into the public space during random periods of time during the day. And they had this pedestrian guide, they were told how to behave, et cetera. So we were essentially mimicking what that public space would look like with more people. And we randomized over hours. So there's an hour randomization. So we actually have surveys of individuals' responses to their perception of public space with our treatment with people and without. And we also looked at behavior. We looked at behavioral response because often what people say is not what people do. Did people actually stay and stick around? Was the street stickier, or was it not? So just results in just one slide. If there's one take home, that the streets were not sticky with more people. In fact, they were repelled. So why do we have typical conditions? On the axis, you have total number of people staying. With people on the right, you can see it's less. But if we break it down by gender, we see very differentiated impacts by women. Women were in fact repelled much more. And so again, this is something that, looking at that high quality public space, you would never think that it's a gendered space or there's any form of exclusion. And yet simply by adding more people, who are majority women, by the way, that women felt much less welcome in that particular space. And the paper on perceptions had similar results, that there were that in general the perceptions of the quality of the space went down just slightly, right? So here perhaps it was the greenery of the space that really made it feel like more of a place of refuge than a place of lingering, and perhaps that space had its own carrying capacity. So White has this idea that public spaces have their carrying capacity where people feel comfortable with. And so perhaps our experiment went beyond that. So that's interesting possibility. But anyways, I think this paper was, I should also see as a proof of concept, because planners do not think experimentally at all. The first, as far as I know, one of the first sort of urban experiments on this sort of topic. So this is the sort of research that I think planners can be doing a little bit more of to create more evidence and or different types of evidence about how different interventions, in this case, urban densification, might influence the quality of the public space. Okay, so now I'm going to focus more on sort of current ongoing work that sort of will give you some clues as to what's going to be happening, what I'd like to be doing in the future. And I've just picked four projects. One project that I'm sort of still responsible for, although not formally, from UBC, is called the UBC Housing and Wellbeing Project. And I'll get into others. So only 4 more things to go. Okay, so this is one project summarized in one slide. And it's motivated with this idea that may sound very, very foreign here in Barcelona, but just bear with me for a minute, that Vancouver is a very lonely city. If you look, a lot of the indicators of it brings in people from all over the world, and yet there's not a very close sense of community. And this has repercussions for the city, but also for the university as well. Surveys on student well-being, students feel that they don't have enough friends, they don't feel like they belong, they're not grounded, they don't have a strong sense of community. And this, of course, has impacts on mental health. And there are questions about whether the physical form of the city may be contributing to this. Physical form, what do I mean by that? I mean these high rises. So Vancouver in the planning world is very well known for creating high dense. So these are these towers surrounded by these beautiful landscapes. There's sort of this in terms of a planning terms, energy efficient, walkable neighborhoods, and yet a lot of people are living in they look like hotels, right? They're not designed like flats here. They're long hotel, like long hallways. And so there's a lot of architects are thinking about, okay, well, how do we design for happier, healthier cities? And many of these, again, talking heads like Charles Montgomery says that architects can design for happier cities, but are we really doing so in practice? And what's this relationship between physical built form and our community relationships? And so the university has a program called Campus as a Living Lab, which is phenomenal because it opens the doors to researchers to do work on campus. And I propose research that could only be done at a university, in which is where you can have an experiment that looks at the relationship between where we live and what our outcomes are in terms of our well-being. It can only be done on a university campus because the university campus decides what's built and who lives where, right? So there's this long waiting list to get into staff and faculty housing. And there's different types of housing typology. So we have low-rise, townhomes, and these high-rise conditions. And so we've been working on sort of narrowing it down. And so we have basically a bunch of applicants that want to get into the housing, and we're going to randomize which group they go into. So they go into condition 1, condition 2, or condition 3. And since there's a waiting list and many people wouldn't get in anyway, we'll be able to follow their social relationships. Do they stay? Do they feel part of the UBC community? How many friends they make? And I'm working with the team. John Halliwell's one of the lead authors on the World Happiness Reports, and sort of Elizabeth Dunn, also a psychologist. And so a lot of other colleagues are working on this project. Okay, second of 4 projects, very different. So this project I call Life in Poblenou, neighborhood that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. This really began with UBC students that in a course that I taught here in Barcelona. They're mostly planning students, but some architecture students. And we, instead of running sort of a academic tourism studio course, come to Barcelona, have a great time, learn about the city, I actually wanted them to get some real work done. And so we put them into studying public life. We put them into 4 sites in Barcelona, and we collected information about pedestrian traffic. So who's moving through the site, who stays by age and gender, what activities are they undertaking, and are there indicators of their social relationships? Do they say hello? Do they hug? Do they kiss? Or are they tourists? Do they take pictures? Are there selfie sticks? And so we're trying to use that real data to then as their starting point for ideas or urban design proposals for the neighborhood. We did it in 2018, we did it in 2019, and then I've kept on collecting this data for the past 2 years. So we have 4 years of data, and I'm thinking, okay, 1-2 years of data is great as a student project, but what happens if we can create some sort of longitudinal data and keep at it? What interesting trends might we see about how the use of public space is changing? So this is our students collecting this data. There's a lot of ways in which you can collect public life data, all the way from basically this takes you from the most simple to the most complicated, right? Facial recognition. And we're way up here, okay? Number 1, manual, and I like getting students in the city as it's a pedagogical tool, right? These are future planners. I want them to be in the city. I want them to be thinking about the data they collect, analyzing their own data. And this is, for me, it's a quite exciting way to work and combine research and teaching. Those are the 4 sites we use. We did Rambla, Poblenou, Marbella on the coast, Superilla, and then Pere-Guard, an area that's being renovated. Just quick view of some of the data. Again, it's exciting because students are presenting to the neighborhood data that no one's produced before, right? This sort of, Silvia Castrojano was like, wow, this is really exciting. We've never seen this sort of information, right? And we have, look at the pedestrian traffic on Rambla, on the Rambla Poblenou, okay? Not Rambla Barcelona, Rambla Poblenou. It's much, much higher than any other sites on all measurements in all years, right? And Superilla has a sort of an inverse pattern, sort of lunchtime pedestrian traffic, right? People come up for lunch, and also sort of after school as well. There's a lot of really interesting data in this. Also, you can like staying activity, we look at by gender, and I'd hope to get a student to help me walk through and see sort of what other insights we can come at. Also, we're based on some of the existing methods, but we're trying to innovate too, right? I mean, just counting people doesn't quite get at the quality of the public space, and so we just came up with this ourselves, right? Like what other ways can we get at other indicators of people? Do they know each other, right? Again, we're being very consistent because we'd like to have comparable data over the next few years. Okay, third project of 4. So I got a call about a year ago, this time from my colleagues at IS Global, that where I spent a year sabbatical along with Isabel's group. They're interested in evaluating this program called Protegemos Escolas, which is a sort of a street calming, pedestrianizing program around schools in Barcelona that many of you probably have seen. And so we put together a project to assess what's the impact of this program. So we're leveraging, this is something that researchers can never do on our own. They're spending millions on this, so we're, great, let's do it. Let's design this impact evaluation in a smart way. This is just one example here. We have the Carrer Lincoln, which had parking on both sides, motorcycle parking and car parking, and now it's been opened up as a public space. And so we were very particular about choosing control or similar control schools so that we can have a pre-post treatment control design with a difference regression. If any of you are ecologists in the ecological world, they call this BACI, before after control intervention, different names for the same thing. We're going to be looking at, again, use of public space, our children playing. We're also counting pedestrian traffic patterns, and we also have some NOx monitors out there as well. We'll be looking at the spatial movement of people through the public space, right? How much more are they occupying the center of the street? This is by the school by the Pompeu Fabra. Here's the Parque de la Ciutadella right here. Beautiful, beautiful redesign. I expect this is all pre-treatment data, right? Because we're not done yet. We're going to pre, but we expect to see much more exciting work based on this. Similar, we're looking at who's staying. So what's the age group? I think there'll be some exciting results from this study. Okay, last project that I'm working on right now. Something that's got me particularly excited, and I'm glad to be working on Esteva with this, and also ICTA master student on bike parking. Okay, so motivation of this study is that cycling infrastructure is necessary to transition to a low carbon economy, and but bike parking is something that's sort of an afterthought. We've been talking a lot about bike lanes, but no one's talking about bike parking, and so I think it's time to get some formality and some rigor into understanding what the dynamics are of bicycle parking. It's also a great project for observation, which is perfect for me, right? So we got a couple students looking at the first order question is just are they being used, right? Like what's the occupancy of these different bike parking stalls? And in my neighborhood where I'm living in Villa de Gracia, they're always full, but in other neighborhoods like where Esteva lives, they're not as full. And so just understanding occupancy levels. Also, what types of bikes? Is it true that they're all being occupied by bike sharing? Or are there kids' bikes? Or are there abandoned bikes? So just this is basic descriptive research, right? But for something like this that really doesn't have a lot of literature, it's the great place to start. And then we're going to be looking at the question of how long are bikes staying, right? Because it's very different if it's just a day use or if it's a long-term use. So we've been out there. We're looking at 158 sites over. We did the first round in February, another round in the summer, and we're to get the rotation number. We put these stickers on there with different colors, and so 9 a.m. had white stickers, and we moved back to 11 a.m. different color stickers, and so we're able to through intense sampling, we're able to get this sense of the rotation, right? So just not to leave you hanging on sort of where is there parking spots and where are there. So basic Gracia and Ciudad Bella are very close to being full. Often there's racks at over 100%, whereas other neighborhoods have very low occupancy levels. So if you live in Los Cortes, it might never even occur to you as a research topic. So we'll be studying this a little bit more. Oh yeah, one more, actually two more. What's parked there? So are they shared? Are they kids' bikes? And here you can see that sort of the breakdown of the distribution there. They're mostly private bikes with some kids' bikes, which is a great sign because we want cities to be for all ages and abilities, right? Meaning from little kids to elderly. So the sort of indicator that the kids are feeling safe enough to get out there. And shared bikes, we found it only a very particular site. So it's very concentrated in areas near tourism, so like Hospital de San Pau or like places where tourists go, but it wasn't in general. We didn't find a whole lot of those. That was a little bit of a surprise. And then with a rotation, we're going to be able to look at produce cool figures like this, where we're going to see total number of bikes and sort of their distribution. We did a sample more than a week later to see if look at long-term storage or how many are actually staying. So more on that to come. Okay, just to conclude, sort of how can I contribute to ICTA? So at UBC and I think the other North American universities, that you typically have the research 40% of your time, teaching 40% of your time, and service 20% of your time. And I'm still figuring out exactly what it's going to look like here at ICTA. But I'm guessing it's going to be something along these lines, where a lot more of my time, I'm imagining, is going to be going to my research group with some teaching and hopefully, keeping the level of service and community building projects, whatever those may need to be. I'm almost doubling my research time, which is really exciting. But I hope that goes to quality and not just quantity. And more specifically, where do I think I can contribute? There are two of the Mariana Maestu societal challenges that I can contribute to. Most obviously is with cities and that group. But I also like to also be connected with the land groups, and some of my past work has looked at sort of land use change and those questions as well. What am I teaching? So just to give you a sense of the teaching that I've done in the past, when I was invited to UBC, I was asked to teach ecological planning. This was actually for the degrowthers, and I think I've mentioned to Yorgos, this was the Bill Reese's course. And so I was often asked, how big are my shoes? Can I fill his shoes? Because of course, Bill Reese, who's the creator of the ecological footprint, was a major force in our unit. So I did not do justice to that course. The ecological planning course I was then asked to revise it to a sort of a sustainability, to take out a lot of the ecological piece and more on sustainability, so more on transportation, more on sort of land use, energy, water, less ecological. And then I was invited to teach one elective course, and I made it a water planning course because my dissertation was on Barcelona's water supply system, sort of water treatment and river management. And so I taught a course on water. I actually just finished teaching it just this summer. I taught it one more time. And then I was also asked to teach in the Masters in Engineering Leadership program, which is, so you can think of this program as sort of an MBA for engineers. And we got the fun part. We got to teach engineers about social systems, right? About issues of inequities and injustice, and looking at Flint, Michigan's water system and how there were sort of structural racism involved in that infrastructure, and looking at issues of gender and discrimination. And I teach a lot through the case method, which I learned at the Harvard Kennedy School, in which students are given a particular case or scenario with data, and then the role of the instructor is to lead the students through the different debates and different questions, and to encourage the students to sort of hash it out, and sort of what course of action would they take if they were the lead decision maker on that case. So for example, in the urban systems and society course, one of the cases was urban homelessness in the New York City's metro, right? So it's a difficult question, right? Because there are jurisdictional issues about what the metro system, if you run that system, you're not responsible. There's police, and yet there are definitely some issues of exclusion involved there. So how do urban managers deal with these societal pressures? They just wanted to go to engineering school to run trains, but there are definitely some societal issues that they need to be aware of and be able to confront. So I really enjoyed teaching in that course. And then there are the studio courses, which I taught. The Barcelona one I mentioned, bringing students here to Barcelona. We also did a program in Morelia, Mexico, where we supported the city at their request to give ideas about an urban river restoration program. So it was a great opportunity, because they just wanted ideas and just students to just push the boundaries of what could be done. So we presented some ideas on what they could do to restore their river. I put in negotiation workshop because I have all these notes of things that I did at the Kennedy School. There are exercises that you can do to practice negotiation. And I've always wanted to just give it a try, even though I'm not a specialist on this topic, but I think that if there's interest, that might be something that we could try. And then I had the opportunity to work in the research design workshop that Isabel created and is still led and participating. That might be an opportunity to contribute as well. And then I also hope to be a somewhat of a bridge. A lot of my mentors have been natural scientists, and even though I'm not doing that sort of work right now, I really enjoy learning about oceanography and the things that Graham's doing. So I really like that world, and so I'd love to, if there's an opportunity to be a bridge between these different worlds, I hope to contribute in that way. And so that's it. My office is up here on the first floor, sort of in that corner. So please come by and I'd be happy to meet and chat with anyone. So thank you very much.
So again, a couple of quick reactions for Jordi. Thank you, Jordi. Before we conclude the meeting. No questions, no reflections. Then I would just
okay.
Yes.
Just to ask something.
Yes, Georgios, please.
Could you tell us with Isabel, because we know also the research agenda of Isabel, so I guess the two of you have discussed like the complementarity. So how do you see your research agendas interacting, diverging?
First, there's something that I was gonna say that I forgot to say is that and let me just take the chance that so it's one of coming to Isabel being here was a big part of me coming because she's such a well-known and respected scholar in the planning field, and maybe it's not apparent if you have her so close by, but coming all the way from Vancouver just to let everyone know that Isabel's a rock star. It's really been exciting to see. I'm very inspired by her work, and we've worked on a couple of projects with some students. And I see us working together. For me, it's great to have someone who has sort of the lens, the justice lens, that I don't have the preparation and skills and all set in that, and it was clearly a priority in the urban agenda. And so I see us working together, and the overlaps will be to be seen. That's in those.
We have different methodologies too. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm completely incapable of running the types of very complex experiments and analysis that comes with experiments that you do. It's not as much my background. Mine is more the politics of urban planning, for the inequality aspect as well. But I think your ecological knowledge also is much stronger than mine, in your ability to think across ecosystems and riversheds and all of that. That's not a part of my background at all.
I'm sure my colleagues Isabel and Xavier won't mind to share this with Georgios, but with the rest of the audience, that bringing Jordi here took many hours of conversations, bottles of wine, and
And Xavier as
Skype
well,
calls at
absolutely.
1 a.m. in the morning because he was in Canada. So Isabel has been instrumental to have Jordi here.
And you actually, it's interesting how we all know one another, because you and Jordi collaborated in Mexico together.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, well, we
So
have a long
I didn't-
history of collaboration.
Yeah, I didn't talk about that.
Xavier, I think, had a question.
Yes, no more than a question and a comment that I think that I can say the same for Jason, that I see that here we have groups like Sostenible that we can share experience. In this case, where I think that was 10 or 12 years ago, we could design a bike pack. And some of the studies that you showed, also we did in the 2008. So from another perspective, materials, space, how to organize the public space, we can share experience that maybe we are not focusing in this moment, but we was studying and can be shared the data that we have, and also with the idea that the city urban lab. So experiment, practice, and touch.
Exactly.
I usually use the word touch. Also in the air, we like to touch the air. That is
Exactly.
okay.
I absolutely agree. And at UBC, there's a big effort to get the engineers to work with the planners and to find that synergy. So I'd just really be interested in learning more about what sort of technologies and what sort of implementation ideas have been put out there. And so.
Okay, I would like to conclude with just a few thoughts. The first one to the audience, please go and chase these guys. Look for them, have coffees, go for lunch. And this obviously also goes for the seniors in the room. Just go look for them, chat. Even if you work with oceans, clearly, I mean, these two guys have the ICTA profile. So they are interested in many, many things, even if their research is very focused. We also learned that both will be pushing research frontiers in their field, that again, they have this ICTA profile of working with different types of data, different methodologies, even different epistemologies, which is something that we welcome in this institute. And something I learned is that if Jordi is not in the office, he's probably drinking alcohol and counting bikes in the Poblano. Yeah, so you can find him there. And I don't know about Jason because he didn't disclose his personal life, but probably he's with Yorgos also drinking a beer somewhere if they are not in the office. So I would just say that we will have a meeting like this again for the new arriving seniors in 2022. So we all, Armin, Elia, and others who may arrive next year. And thank you to the audience for coming and meeting our new colleagues today. So thanks very much.
It's